On a silent night, an unsettling calm hung over Europe. The year 1944 had already witnessed countless battles, but the one that was approaching would be different. The Atlantic Ocean, which had once seemed vast and impenetrable, was now becoming the last line of defense for the darkest regime in modern history. And on that night, under the shadow of the stars, the greatest military operation the world had ever known was beginning to take shape. It was June 5th, and a nearly tangible tension surrounded the Allies. The future of Europe was being decided on a battlefield that stretched from the fields of England to the beaches of Normandy, France. The plan was set, but doubt, fear, and risk hung in the air. As night fell, uncertainty about the success of the mission took hold. The vastness of what was to come, in some ways, deafened even the most experienced. That night, over 150,000 men were gathered in silence, waiting for the order to embark on a crossing that would take them to one of the greatest tests of courage and endurance of all time. The distance between fear and bravery, between survival and sacrifice, seemed infinitely short. Meanwhile, on the opposite side, on the beaches of Normandy, the Nazi war machine stood on full alert. Strong fortifications, trenches, and a force of well-trained soldiers awaited them. They had one command, one singular objective: to keep the invasion at bay at any cost. But as the night stretched on, a new kind of force was being assembled. A force that could not be measured merely with tanks or weapons, but with determination, courage, and the weight of an entire world resting on the shoulders of each man preparing to face the unknown. It was more than a military attack. It was hope against oppression, the beginning of a revolution that, if successful, would change the fate of millions. D-Day would not just be an invasion, but the awakening of freedom. The dawn of June 6, 1944, would be the light of dawn that illuminated a new path, where ordinary men, soldiers, would take to the skies and the land in a cry for a world free from tyranny. And so, as the night dragged on and the waiting became almost unbearable, the clock continued ticking, marking the minutes until what would be the greatest battle in the history of humankind. A day that would change everything, where courage and sacrifice would intertwine in the waves of history. Now, it was just a matter of time. The light of day was about to come, and with it, the future. Before any soldier set foot on the sands of Normandy, before the shouts of command and the deafening sounds of battle, there was a plan. A plan so intricate, so vast, and meticulously crafted that it defied the imagination. What was about to happen at dawn on June 6, 1944, was not the result of a mere military impulse, but the culmination of months, if not years, of preparation, calculation, and, above all, boldness. D-Day, or, as it became known, the day of the landing, Operation Overlord, was not just a conventional invasion. It was the largest coordinated military operation the world had ever witnessed. And for a movement of such magnitude to be possible, much more than courage was needed. It required strategy, secrecy, and a spirit of collaboration between the Allied nations. At the operations table, General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of the Allied forces, was the conductor of this symphony. Under his direction, the complex dance of thousands of men, ships, planes, and supplies was being carefully rehearsed. Every move was calculated, every mistake catastrophic. The key to success was not just the number of soldiers, but the precision of the execution. For months, the Allies had prepared in secret. No one knew exactly when and where the attack would take place. To the Nazi high command, the attack could happen anywhere, but at no point did they anticipate that the Allies would choose Normandy, a seemingly unlikely region for a large-scale invasion. However, the choice of this area, with its vast beaches and dense forests, had a strategic purpose: to disorient the enemy, scatter their forces, and open a new front that would dilute Nazi resistance in France. But the strategy was not limited to the element of surprise. A masterful manipulation of the enemy's forces was required. The Allies knew that, for a successful invasion, they needed more than just an aerial and naval assault. They needed to deceive the Nazis on every front. And this is where one of the greatest intelligence maneuvers in history came into play. To mislead the Germans about the true location of the invasion, the Allies created a massive facade. An operation called Fortitude was mounted with the task of making the Nazis believe the invasion would take place in Pas-de-Calais, just 30 kilometers from England, rather than in Normandy, hundreds of kilometers away. Fake troops were created, with warehouses and inflatable vehicles. Even fictitious figures like General Patton were placed in charge of non-existent armies. Communication lines were flooded with disinformation, and the Nazis, so confident in their intelligence, fell into the trap. While the Germans prepared for an imminent battle elsewhere, the Allies were concentrating their true force on the Normandy coast. To the German generals, Normandy seemed an unlikely choice. The terrain was difficult, and the coastline poorly defended. But the most dangerous element for the Nazis was what they did not know: the enormous logistical operation the Allies were assembling. Under the cloak of complete secrecy, the Allies gathered a fleet of more than 5,000 ships, ranging from massive warships to small landing craft, all ready to cross the English Channel. But the invasion didn't rely solely on the ships. The sky would also be a battlefield. During the night before the attack, more than 13,000 Allied aircraft would fly over Europe, sowing chaos and confusion behind enemy lines. Heavy bombings targeted the destruction of Nazi air defenses and communication lines, while thousands of paratroopers would silently descend at night behind enemy lines to sabotage key points and prepare the ground for the landing. For the Allied forces, D-Day was not just about landing on the beaches. It was about securing air superiority, destroying the enemy's communication posts, taking down bridges, and destroying railways. It was about, in short, ensuring that the Nazis would never have a chance to respond effectively. And while thousands of soldiers prepared to land on the beaches, others, behind the scenes, were orchestrating the final pieces of this strategic puzzle. For the Allies, the battle would not be won solely through brute force, but through the combination of air, naval, and ground power, all driven by a shared vision: the defeat of Hitler and the liberation of Europe. Every movement was a well-thought-out play, every detail an essential piece in the puzzle. Like a conductor, Eisenhower directed a symphony of strategies. The soldiers, the airmen, the sailors, the engineers, the spies, all united in a monumental effort to ensure that when the first soldier stepped onto the beach at Normandy, he would do so carrying the weight of a carefully orchestrated operation that left no room for failure. The success of this mission, even in the face of adversity, was guaranteed by one thing: human courage, coupled with the most sophisticated military strategy the world had ever witnessed. The operation was ready. The plan was in place. And now, there was only one thing left to do: wait for the light of dawn. June 6, 1944. As the first light of morning began to appear on the horizon, the entire world seemed to hold its breath. For the Allies, this was not just the dawn of a new day. It was the awakening of a new era. On the shores of Normandy, the Allied forces were in position, ready to launch the largest military assault in history. The moment was about to arrive, and when it did, nothing would ever be the same. For many, the war would end at that moment. For others, it would be the last dawn they would ever see. It was 6:30 in the morning. The beaches of Normandy were still shrouded in the veil of early morning fog. The sun, weak and uncertain, began to sneak its way across the sky, revealing to the Allied forces a scene that seemed calm, but would soon become a hell. At that moment, thousands of men were about to face a challenge that few had imagined possible. The first men to set foot on the beaches of Normandy were not heroes forged in legend. They were ordinary men, young and inexperienced soldiers, whose only desire was to fulfill their duty. They had trained for months, but no training could prepare them for the immeasurable violence and chaos that awaited them. They were ready to face the worst, but the worst was something that could not be imagined until it was right before their eyes. The first wave of landings began with a deafening roar. Dozens of landing craft, carrying soldiers and supplies, crossed the English Channel under the weight of monumental expectation. Each boat was a point in a vast network pulled by the tide of war. Inside each of these boats, the silence was deafening. There were no words, only the muffled sounds of hearts beating faster, the sound of deep, nervous breaths. The beach, the line of fire, was an abyss the soldiers had to cross. As the boats neared the shore, panic mixed with determination. The German forces, strongly positioned, were ready. Heavy artillery pointed to the horizon, and the men in the trenches were eager to open fire. They knew that the beach would be the scene of a massacre. But unlike many of the Allied soldiers, they knew the terrain, the positions, and the ferocity with which the attack would be repelled. And then, hell opened. On the beaches of Utah and Omaha, the resistance was fierce and unrelenting. At that very moment, the first soldiers to land encountered a wall of fire. The sound of German machine guns, firing relentlessly, mixed with the deafening explosions of mines and bombs. The landing waves were becoming a chaotic, deadly battlefield. The sand, which was supposed to be the beach of liberation, was covered in blood, and the fallen bodies were a brutal reminder of the fury of war. For those who made it to the beach, the scene was one of total destruction. Some tried to advance, but the German fortifications were formidable, and the barbed wire fences, buried mines, and concrete obstacles made every meter gained a colossal sacrifice. The men were not just facing a line of defense. They were facing the total resistance of an enemy that knew it would lose, but refused to surrender. But despite the horror, despite the terrible casualties, the men did not retreat. Even under enemy fire, some soldiers were determined to advance, to take the position, to tear down the barriers. And with time, the tide of the battle began to shift. Brave soldiers, whose names would often be lost to history, rose against adversity and took the enemy fortifications one by one. Each advance was a victory over fear, over death, over everything war tried to impose. It was the price of freedom, the cost of peace. Every man who fell that day played his part in ensuring that the freedom of the future would not be lost. For many, this would be the last act of their lives. But for those who survived, the images of those beaches, the sounds of explosions, and the visions of comrades falling around them would be indelible, marking their souls forever. But the sacrifice would not be in vain. Those who survived that first onslaught knew that D-Day was just beginning. And as night fell, more waves of soldiers, equipment, and reinforcements would arrive to ensure that what had started on the beaches of Normandy would not be just a blow, but the beginning of liberation. Imagine the scene, June 6, 1944. The cold morning breeze on Omaha Beach, the sound of planes flying overhead, and in the distance, the fortified hills that watched coldly and imposingly over the impending landing. There was no clear path, no guarantees. There was only the feeling that the fate of the world was being decided with every second, with every step taken on those beaches saturated with fear and determination. Among those who arrived in the first waves of the landing were young soldiers like John Steele, a paratrooper from the 101st Airborne Division who parachuted into Normandy that morning. Steele had the luck, or misfortune, of landing on one of the ominous street lights of the town, hanging in the air while bullets sliced through the sky. Others were scattered, some falling right into the battlefield, their boots filled with blood, unable to know where they were, or what would happen next. Steele would later become a symbol of silent courage, but at that moment, he was just a man trying to survive. But it wasn't just the story of a lone soldier. On every side of the beach, at every line of fire, men were facing the unknown. In every unit, on every beach, there were soldiers who barely knew what to expect. For some, the fight for survival was a struggle against the fear of the unknown. For others, it was a fight for their very lives where death was just a few steps away. As the battle raged on the beaches, many of the soldiers who landed were not recognized heroes, but young men, many of them under 20, who were following orders without knowing what awaited them. Many would die before they even saw an enemy. For those who survived, the experience was more than just the horror of battle. It was a shock of seeing comrades fall around them, the impact of an explosion that killed a friend, the pain of seeing a soldier drag himself away from the beach with a shattered leg, and the moment when they realized that, perhaps, all that remained was to move forward. At Omaha Beach, the scene was even more terrifying. The first waves of soldiers faced an unrelenting wall of fire, machine guns, artillery, and rifles raining down on them from the hills around. Some soldiers never made it off the landing crafts before being hit. Others reached the beach, but the water, already red with the blood of their comrades, seemed to swallow those who tried to advance. It was a scene of pure carnage, but those who survived had no time to hesitate. They were the ones advancing, the ones carrying the flag of the future on their shoulders, the ones who, for the most part, were the anonymous ones in the grand story of the war. But heroism was there, amid the death and destruction. It was the soldier who carried his wounded friend on his back, even under enemy fire. It was the soldier who, with a broken leg, still fought to advance because he knew there were lives behind him that depended on his movement. They were simple, silent gestures that, when added together, made all the difference. Amid the chaos, many of these men acted with a courage that transcended fear. Not because they were unafraid, but because they knew there was no other option. The sacrifice was not just personal, it was collective. Now, imagine the scene. The smoke of explosions mixed with the acrid scent of burnt metal. The unbearable heat of the sun. The muffled voices of distant screams. The sounds of boots pounding on the sand. For every soldier who fell, there were others who kept marching, dragging themselves to the front lines, feeling the pressure of an uncertain future, but determined to keep going. Each of them, regardless of their name or story, had a key role to play. They were not great heroes, but each one was a crucial part of a larger machine. They were the anonymous heroes. These anonymous heroes were not seeking fame. They were not seeking honor. They were fighting for what many of us now take for granted, freedom. They were fighting an enemy not only in the name of their countries, but in the name of a future that seemed ever more distant. The sacrifices of these soldiers may not have been immediately recognized, but the impact of their actions was eternal. Today, when we walk along the beaches of Normandy, we see the monuments and gravestones that celebrate the bravery and sacrifice of those who could not return. But as we do so, we must remember that for every name engraved in stone, there were many others whose deeds went unrecorded. They were the men who, without hesitation, put their bodies in front of the future, not with great words, but with simple, heroic, and courageous actions. D-Day was not just a military victory. It was a human victory. The courage of these men, these anonymous heroes, did more than change the course of the war. It changed the course of history. And for that reason, with every step we take, we must remember who they were and what they did. Because the freedom we have today is, in large part, the result of the sacrifices of those who, unnamed and unrecognized, marched forward step by step into history. The moment the first soldiers set foot on the beaches of Normandy, they were already facing more than just the strength of a determined enemy. What they didn't know, as they charged into battle, was that they were about to face an invisible enemy. The relentless terrain, the strategy of the Nazi defenders, and the absolute chaos of the landing. The advance seemed impossible, and many believed survival would be a miracle. Let's imagine the scene, June 6, 1944. At 6:30, the first waves of Allied soldiers begin to land on the beaches of Normandy. They knew they were about to face a brutal fight, but no one could predict the magnitude of the challenges that would arise. In some areas, like Omaha Beach, the German forces were ready to crush any attempt to advance. The biggest challenge the soldiers faced right after landing was the terrain itself. The beaches were full of obstacles, barbed wire, landmines buried in the sand, and anti-tank ditches that seemed to appear from nowhere. Every step was a gamble of life or death, and even the most experienced soldiers knew they were walking through a minefield. The soldiers, the unsung heroes, found themselves surrounded not only by the enemy, but by the treacherous nature of the environment itself. Many were wounded or killed before even reaching the first line of defense. The Nazi war machines, heavy machine guns, anti-aircraft cannons, and snipers positioned on the hills made any attempt to advance seem like suicide. However, what happened next was nothing short of extraordinary. Human resilience. Amid the chaos, some soldiers began to stand out for their courage and leadership, but it wasn't the kind of leadership one might expect. It wasn't a commander giving orders from above. It was ordinary soldiers in desperate positions, making split-second decisions with no time to think. They made decisions that, at first glance, seemed absurd, but they were the only ones that could save their lives and ensure the operation wasn't a failure. Even under intense fire, they began using the obstacles to their advantage, adapting to the terrain and creating new ways to push forward. It was the soldier who, with death at his heels, threw himself on a grenade to save his friends. The soldier who, even with panic overtaking him, found the strength to rescue a comrade who had fallen under a hail of bullets. The soldier who, in a moment of total darkness, was willing to risk everything to ensure the front line was held. These soldiers faced not only the force of enemy weapons, but the force of a desperation that can only be understood by those who were there. And it was there, amidst the explosions and the constant sound of war, that the greatness of the human spirit was revealed. Even when the beach seemed like a field of death, with fallen bodies and the waves stained red, some soldiers were able to improvise and adapt strategies that helped them break through the enemy defenses. Men who, with the help of improvised equipment, managed to neutralize an enemy machine gun or create a gap in the barbed wire with grenades and explosives. Every step taken on the hot, bloody sand was an impossible advance, but a necessary one. However, the path to success was not a straight line. The Allied soldiers faced difficulties that seemed insurmountable. Communication with supporting units was disrupted, the landing waves did not go as planned, and reinforcements arrived later than expected. Some of their biggest obstacles were not the enemies themselves, but the limitations of their training and the lack of coordination between different branches of the Allied forces. But, paradoxically, these failures also became fertile ground for creativity and adaptation. The soldiers didn't stop. Even when the situation seemed hopeless, the determination in their eyes was unshakable. Each wave of troops that arrived at Omaha Beach was a new opportunity to break through the defenses, to reverse the impossible. They used the disorder to their advantage, formed improvised groups, and, with an unexpected sense of unity, began capturing enemy positions one by one. The advance was painful, but not impossible. The soldiers who were there, those who survived hell, were more than just warriors. They were symbols of an unbreakable resistance, of a humanity that refused to give in, even when logic pointed in the opposite direction. Every movement, every decision, every breath amidst the smoke and blood represented more than just a victory on the battlefield. It was a declaration that, when men unite for a cause greater than themselves, no challenge is impossible. In those moments, when the line between life and death blurred with each passing second, the soldiers realized that, even in the face of unimaginable challenges, there was something stronger than fear. It was the will to win, to advance, to fight for a future that they knew they would never see, but which they knew was the reason they were there. D-Day was, in many ways, an impossible advance. But, like every great battle, it taught that the impossible is not a barrier, but merely a challenge to be overcome. Every step taken on those beaches, every risky decision, was proof of humanity's ability to adapt, resist, and ultimately conquer what seemed unattainable. The victory won on the beaches of Normandy on June 6, 1944, brought with it more than a sense of relief. It was marked by a heavy silence, not of defeat, but of a deep and irreversible weight. When the Allied forces finally broke through the Nazi defense lines and advanced to liberate occupied Europe, what they found was not just the celebration of a victory. It was the burden of a transformed world. When the first American, British, and Canadian soldiers managed to establish a beachhead, it was a monumental achievement. The advance was immense, but the land they stepped on was marked by the pain of millions who had been oppressed. The liberation of towns and villages meant the breaking of a years-long nightmare, but also the acknowledgement that evil had left deep, perhaps irreparable, wounds. As the troops advanced through the liberated cities, what seemed like a liberation for the occupied Europeans was, in fact, a complex reality. The streets were still shadowed, with the smell of death and destruction hanging in the air. The citizens who had survived the Nazi regime didn't know how to react. It was a cry of freedom, but also one of loss, as many of the survivors had already lost everything: family, home, identity. For the Allied soldiers, what began as a military mission of liberation quickly turned into a psychological nightmare. Even when they encountered the liberated populations, many were empty, not knowing what to expect. There was relief in knowing they had done their duty, but also the burden of seeing the human cost of that victory. The soldiers were changed. The men who had landed on the beaches of Normandy were the same ones now marching through ruined cities. The images of fallen comrades, faces twisted in pain, bodies left behind on those bloodied beaches, were etched in their minds. Victory did not bring only celebration. It also brought the weight of deep reflection. What does freedom really cost? At what price does a world war come? Liberation, as much as it was celebrated, also required an awareness of sacrifice. For those on the front lines, every victory seemed to dilute the meaning of a war that, until that moment, had seemed endless. Many soldiers knew that the real struggle wouldn't end on the beaches of Normandy or in the streets of Paris, but in the hearts of those who would return home. By the end of World War II, when the victory flag was raised, a new era was also emerging. But the price paid, the loss of lives, entire families, and a world that had to rebuild from the rubble of war, was incalculable. What remained, then, after the liberation, was the legacy. The legacy of a generation marked by war, but that, through pain, built a new world order. The soldiers who returned home after the victory on D-Day faced a complex reality. They were not only heroes, but also men broken, marked by painful memories that could never be erased. Even with victory, peace was not complete, as the ghosts of war still lived, invisible, in the minds of those who had participated in that epic battle. But over time, the victory was transformed into legacy. The generations that grew up after the war looked at the sacrifices made and began to build a peaceful Europe, a rebuilt Europe, where the names of destroyed cities were renewed, and where the sounds of war turned into conversations about liberty, equality, and fraternity. The legacy of the D-Day soldiers is not just the land conquered or the cities liberated. Their true legacy lies in the memory of their sacrifices, in the courage they showed, and in the responsibility they left for future generations. D-Day, in the end, was not just a battle won. It was a reminder that freedom is never guaranteed, and that true victory is the ability to preserve humanity, even after everything has been lost. And so, the legacy of liberation spreads through the years. The scars of war may fade over time, but the lessons it left behind should never be forgotten. D-Day was a milestone in history, but also a perpetual reminder that the peace we enjoy today was won, at a high cost, by those who dared to face the impossible. D-Day, a crucial milestone of World War II, is not just a moment in history. It is, above all, a testament to unshakable courage, immense sacrifice, and human strength in the face of the impossible. Today, when we look back at the massive landing operation on the beaches of Normandy, we are reminded not only of the men who marched under flags and weapons, but also of the lives shaped by the power of collective action, by resilience in the midst of chaos, and by the fight for what is just and humane. Every soldier who stepped onto the beaches of Normandy, every life lost, every sacrifice made, composed a chapter in a story of pain and overcoming that still resonates today. If victory was won with sweat and blood, it also brought with it lessons that are still present, even if invisible, in the choices we make in the world today. The legacy of D-Day is not just about the liberated territories, military victories, or the grand triumphs of a world war. It is about what remains after the battles. D-Day teaches us that true strength is not just military, but moral and human. Every soldier who faced the unknown on that June 6th, every comrade who fought alongside another, knew that their mission was not just to conquer land, but to ensure that future generations would live in freedom without the yoke of tyranny. The echoes of D-Day are not only in the stones of Normandy or in the memories of those who were there. They live in each of us, in the freedom we have today, and perhaps in the shadows of the choices we still make. The price of peace is high, and as history reminds us, it is never guaranteed. But as we move toward the future, we can carry the responsibility of remembering. Let us never forget the sacrifices made by those who crossed the English Channel on that D-Day. May their bravery, their lost lives, and their stories of overcoming remind us of the true value of freedom. And may we, with the same courage, build a world where peace is not just a goal, but a living reality for all. D-Day was not just a historic milestone. It was, and will continue to be, a lesson about the power of the human spirit in the face of adversity. May its memories stay with us, so that the weight of victory is never lost, and so that we can move forward, more united, more aware, and more grateful to those who gave us the chance to live in freedom.